Daniel, very happy to have you here.
Great to be here, Archie.
Yeah, how are you finding London?
I'm loving London. I was born in England, but I've only ever spent like about 3 days of my life in London, but it's a beautiful city.
I didn't know that about you. I thought you're just a Kiwi.
No.
Yeah, just a Kiwi.
England.
Yeah, but you were born here.
Yep.
Wow. Okay.
I was here for 6 weeks, and then my parents from Paris for a year, and then most of the rest of my life in New Zealand.
You didn't pick up any Parisian habits in that first year of life, like smoking or...
I learnt how to fill my nappies in some of the best cafes in Paris, but not to speak the language.
Man of culture.
Yeah.
Environmentalist.
Yeah.
Very important to state that because, when I came into Bitcoin, there were really not too many voices who were openly, proudly, lifelong, committed environmentalists. And that's a really important thing that we now have in Bitcoin. Not just you, but we now have more people who are speaking out, making the case quite strongly, logically, rationally, and emphatically that Bitcoin is really good for the environment. Entrepreneur, you've got a background in technology, and now you're an investor as well. So like Bitcoin has brought all of those things together.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like a unifying life mission.
Yeah, it's a unified field theory in a way. Yeah.
So
and I find that all those things become relevant. It's fascinating.
Yeah, you're not quite the unknown online account now. You've got quite the profile, and I would say like you're the go-to voice for the environmental case for Bitcoin now. You make it really powerfully. I really enjoy your writing and your work and your advocacy. Really right from the start, as soon as I saw it, that tweet that we spoke about, it really just, it was very powerful for me, and I had to reach out to you at the time, and, we did a couple of spaces back then, and today we're in my studio. So,
yeah, it's great to be here.
I'm really happy to see you becoming so much more prominent and influential.
Oh, you're part of the journey.
Well, I feel like I'm starting all over again, and I like that feeling. There's, it's a challenge. There's anxiety and all the rest of that, but so committed to trying to make this a success, and it's going to be a part of my learning curve as well, learning how to do this. So let's start with the environmental case for Bitcoin, because for a lot of people who are not very familiar with your work and the arguments that you've made so popular, it can seem like a counterintuitive position. Now, I have in sort of my private life, I've spoken to people who have, I guess their work is in investment banking and like, and I don't really tell them what I do, or at least at that point when I was having those conversations, I didn't tell them what I did, and the conversation would come up as Bitcoin, and I got the reflexive objections, reflexive comments. And that's the sort of battle that we've been fighting against for many, many years, but especially since you've come on the scene as well still, despite the work that you've done, despite the progress that we've made convincing so many people. So what is the environmental case for Bitcoin? Where do we start in trying to help people understand what that is?
It's not one thing, it's 4 things together. The primary thing is we live in a world where there's been so much greenwash, where so many people have claimed that they're doing good things for the environment, and then we dig a little deeper and we find out that for every ton of carbon dioxide they're mitigating, they're creating 10,000. And so people are understandably, including myself, we're on high alert. And when I first looked at Bitcoin, I had the same, I'll be honest, it was a reflexive negative reaction. Oh, this uses a lot of energy. Step 1. Oh, this is only a speculative asset. Step 2, with no other value, which leads you to the conclusion, step 3, this is bad for the environment. This is wasteful. So those 2 things come together. We have to believe that it's useless other than as a speculative asset. And we have to also believe that energy usage means it's bad for the environment in order to conclude that Bitcoin is bad for the environment. But when we unpack this, we realize that neither of those 2 supporting premises are true. Number 1, it's not the case that it's only a speculative asset. It has massive benefit to humanity. most of which is felt outside the West, so we don't necessarily see it, but it doesn't mean it's not real, doesn't mean it doesn't happen just because it's not commonly reported upon. And the second component is that just because it uses energy doesn't mean it's bad for the environment. It's down to the way that a technology consumes energy that defines whether it's good or bad for the environment. Now, rather than go into the intricacies of how grids work and how grid balancing works, which would have confused me and would confuse anyone else unless they're a grid engineer, I'll just use a simple analogy. So imagine if you go to a health practitioner and you say, hey, I want to improve my health. And they say to you, well, consuming too much food is bad, so you should consume less food. That's the solution. Eat a third as much food. Would you have trust in that health practitioner? Would you think that's sound advice?
It would only be a problem if overconsumption was the problem.
Exactly.
But if you're not accurately diagnosing the problem, then it's not going to solve anything.
Correct. Well, let's imagine, I know you're not, you're in good shape, but let's imagine you were overweight and you weren't in good shape, right? That would not be the solution either. It's a more nuanced approach, which is, well, there's a difference. Not all food is equal. Chocolate cake, decreasing the amount of chocolate cake will have more impact than decreasing the amount of fresh fruit and vegetables that you eat. In fact, you could eat more fresh fruit and vegetables and less chocolate cake, and that would increase your health and everything else stayed the same. So it's the same with energy consumption. We have these very inflexible types of energy consumption, such as an AI inference data center, which has to be up all the time, 99.999% of the time. And that means that it has to be fueled by something which is a very reliable source of power, i.e. nuclear, hydro, gas, or coal. And not every jurisdiction has nuclear or hydro, so often the common denominator is fossil fuel. And then you have a flexible user of energy. And the more flexible that it is, then the more that you're able to support that consumer of energy using variable renewable energy. So in this whole big equation of consumption, data centers, traditional data centers in Bitcoin mining, are not in this one homogeneous group. The AI data centers, they're like chocolate cake to the grid, whereas the Bitcoin mining, that's your fruit and veg. That's the thing you actually want more of, because the more intermittent variable renewable energy, i.e. solar and wind, you place onto a grid, the more you have to have consumers of energy that are flexible in their patterns. I was talking to a nuclear safety engineer from Japan. He actually coordinated the response effort from the American and the Japan efforts after the Fukushima disaster. Worked for TEPCO for many years. He's now pioneering Bitcoin mining. Why? Because after Japan shut down a lot of their nuclear reactors, they moved to importing more fossil fuel, but also starting more renewables. And he learnt firsthand working at TEPCO that as you put more renewables onto a grid, it becomes harder to stabilize and you need more flexible users of energy. And he said that basically once you hit about 50% solar and wind penetration on a grid, it starts to max out. It's very hard to go beyond that and keep the grid stable and reliable. He said, but when you use Bitcoin mining in concert with it, you can get it right up to 70%. So that's phenomenal. So there are many environmental benefits to Bitcoin, as it turns out. This is just one of them, but it's a huge benefit. The benefit of being able to go from 50 to 70% variable renewable energy penetration on a grid can make substantial difference to the health of the planet. And the thing I really love about it is you get into these debates where, generally speaking, if you're more politically left-leaning, you'll care more about energy sustainability. If you're more politically center-right, you'll care more about energy security. And we go on these yo-yos, and we've seen it in the States right now. We've gone from Inflation Reduction Act and big emphasis on renewable subsidies to throw all that out, drill, baby, drill. And there is actually no way you can have both energy security, energy affordability, and energy sustainability at the same time without ultra flexible users of energy. And the most flexible in the world is Bitcoin mining. It's literally the bridge in the middle that allows the left and the right to stop opposing each other and both get what they care about. That's how important it is.
So there's two elements to that calculation. There's the demand side and the supply side, right? And so why not just build more renewable energy infrastructure just build it without the Bitcoin mining?
Supply and demand. The answer is in the question. Basic economics says if you're going to have more supply of something to survive economically, you need to have more demand for that, right? So if you're going to have a new bakery in the street in Shoreditch, right, you're going to need people who are eating bread who can be going to that bakery. Otherwise, it's going to shut down. So in the same sense, if you put more renewable energy or any new energy onto a grid, you need more people who are demanding that energy, who are a customer for that energy. Otherwise, that will be a white elephant, and it'll be dependent on government subsidies to keep it alive, and therefore it'll get attacked by people who are saying, why is it there in the first place? So it's not sustainable economically. So more renewable energy on the grid actually needs more demand for energy. And so if you don't have more demand for that energy, you're not going to achieve that transition, and you're not going to be able to swap out and shut down some of those coal plants or whatever. It's going to be absolutely impossible economically without massive, massive unsustainable subsidies. And so the choice is, do we have inflexible energy users like you and I? We're actually, individual human beings are the worst users of energy for the grid operator because we're very inflexible in our usage patterns. We use very little energy during the day. We use a lot in the morning, and we use a lot at 6 o'clock when we finish work or whatever time it is. And typically that's the time where the sun's going behind a cloud or setting on the horizon. So there's less solar energy, but there's more demand at the same time. And we're inflexible. We don't change our patterns and suddenly say, okay, well, that's bad. So I'll change my routine. I'll get up at 4 a.m. in the morning and I'll stop work at 3. So people aren't going to do that for the most part. But when you have a flexible user of energy that can very quickly ramp up and ramp down, depending on the grid owner's desires and needs, that's when you can counterbalance that variable renewable energy. So you want more supply of more renewable energy, you have to have more demand. And the best sort of demand is the most flexible sort you can possibly get.
So as you've explained, most energy demand from consumers and perhaps even industry is fairly predictable, and you can build a business case for the infrastructure, the provision, the supply and the generation of power for those consumers. But what tends to happen is when there's a spike down or up in demand due to environmental factors or perhaps some kind of accident reduces the capacity to generate the required amount of energy, we need a buffer amount that can be filled by renewable energy that can be bought up by Bitcoin miners who are then able to switch off when and if that extra 20, 10, 20, 30% capacity is required under certain circumstances, and they can just switch off in an instant. But the way you've explained it to me is that there aren't any other industries who can do that. They can't just switch off.
Correct.
So why can Bitcoin miners do that, and why can't other industries just do that, for example?
Well, the go-to option for grid owners in the past to power down electricity usage to stabilize a grid when demand peaks has been an aluminium smelter or a steel factory. That's been pretty much it. And they've been able to do it because they have contracts with the grid owner that says, hey, we don't really want to do it, but if you'll give us some money to do it, we'll do it. And it's called demand response. It's been around for more than 20 years. There's a number of problems with that, though. The first problem is that there's very few people who compete in those demand response programs, which are often given to people by auctions. So when you've only got one steel factory and one aluminium smelter competing to offer that service, they can charge a lot of money, which is expensive for the grid operators. The second problem is you can't just switch off a steel factory like that. You've got to go through a whole sequence of industrial processes. So they can't deliver that power instantly. It's going to take at least half an hour. And the third issue is that they cannot stay off for very long because steel starts to harden after a number of hours. Key industrial processes become irreversible. So they can only give a 4-hour window. Well, what use is that if you've got an ice storm, which is lasting for 3 days? So where Bitcoin mining is different is, number one, it can power down within seconds. Secondly, because there's so much of it, it offers a new auctioneer for that demand response service So the whole marketplace to offer demand and response becomes more cost effective, which means the grid owner doesn't have to pay as much for it, and that's a benefit back to the consumer that helps to lower the cost of energy. But the other advantage is there's two others. Number one, it's very flexible. So if you have a steel factory, it's either on or off. You have an aluminium smelter, it's either on or off. So maybe you have a shortfall of energy and you ask the aluminium smelter to power down. Now you've lost all that power. Now you've got the opposite problem, which is now you've got to counterbalance the fact that you've lost too much demand. Whereas a Bitcoin mining company, you can say, we need exactly this much energy to come offline. And of course, Bitcoin mining rigs are modular. They just switch off the exact requirement, and then they can keep in touch with the grid operator to know over time exactly how much they need. So they're continuously calibrating and they're balancing the grid continuously. So that's never been in existence. And the third thing is they're not limited. There's no process that breaks after 4 hours. So they can stay off for 3 days, which is exactly what's happened on grids such as Texas, where they have had peak heat waves or ice storms that have lasted for 72 hours. They've stayed offline for that entire time and helped to stabilize the grid.
And so you have numerous stakeholders in a situation like Texas. You've got the grid operator, you've got the consumers, the citizens, the Bitcoin miners. Which one of those are unhappy about that situation?
There's only one person who's unhappy about it, and that's the people who used to be selling gas peaker plants to the grid operators. So Hathaway Energy, for example. They're very unhappy with this arrangement. So yeah, the consumers win because they get cheaper power. The grid operator wins because they get fewer heart attacks. They get to keep their jobs. The grid stays up more of the time, and they're not stressing about how to counterbalance it. The Bitcoin mining companies are happy because they're getting paid to be able to power down. But remember, that's a service that they're providing to the grid, which is absolutely vital that someone else will be earning that money for anyway, and they wouldn't be doing as good a job. So everyone's happy apart from the suppliers of gas peaker plants. Because what used to happen, this is a paradox of the renewable transition.
Can I just interrupt you? That's not you just saying that, right?
Not at all.
The Texas grid operator,
correct,
in their own words, released many statements, right? And official statements, not just a, word of mouth sort of thing.
Yeah, nothing of this is my opinion. This is all either through researching the peer-reviewed studies and the actual case studies. And fortunately, since 2021, we've seen what's happened when we've had renewables grow in the area of Texas from 80 gigawatts up to 140 gigawatts over just 4 years, and how Bitcoin mining has been critical to the continued growth without threatening grid stability, as they've had more peak weather events, as they've had more people migrate in, which has increased demand upon the grid. So what generally happens when you get more variable renewable energy on the grid is the grid operator says, we need backup because they're variable. So what happens when the wind isn't blowing? What happens when the sun goes behind a cloud? Unpredictable events throughout the day. They have to have a backup solution instantly. So let's say that suddenly the wind goes flat and the sun goes behind the cloud at the same time, and it's nearing a time where energy demand is ramping up at about 5:30, and suddenly they're like, whoops, hang on. And on top of that, let's say that temperatures drop, which can happen at the same time. So everyone turns on their aircon, right? So demand goes up because of the climate. Demand goes up because it's that time of day. Supply goes down because the wind's gone behind a cloud. The sun's gone behind a cloud, and the wind stopped blowing. So you get a confluence of these different events. And so it doesn't happen that often, but once in every 100 days, it might happen. And so they have to have this thing called a gas peaker plant, which is a fossil fuel-driven generator of energy that they can turn up instantly so that the grid doesn't brown out or black out. Now, the thing about a gas peaker plant is that in order to have it fire up instantly, it needs to be running. It needs to be idling. So you might only use it 6% of the year, but it has to be idling 100% of the year, all the time, releasing CO2 emissions. Very expensive. In fact, in Texas, it was going to have costed the grid operator $18 billion to have the backup plan for when that renewable energy was non-available at an unpredictable time. they tried another experiment. They were lobbied very heavily by Hathaway Energy for a long time to buy these gas peaker plants. The new grid operator came in after the blackouts and brownouts of 2021 after Winter Storm Uri, where people lost their lives because the electricity grid went down. Billions of dollars of business was lost. And Brad Jones investigated a number of ways to rectify the situation. First thing he did was he weatherized all the renewable generation and all the fossil fuel generation as well, because that had sometimes frozen. The wind turbine blades had frozen, so the equipment was weatherized to be better protected. He realized that wasn't enough, though. He also needed something to load balance. And so he looked at gas peaker plants, but then he also looked at Bitcoin mining. And he said, well, this is interesting. And he's not a Bitcoiner. He was looking at it from a grid operator's perspective. How do I balance this grid when I've got so much variable renewable energy and I've just had an absolute disaster where people lost lives, businesses lost billions, and the grid operator lost his job? And he looked at Bitcoin and he started researching. And he was like, hang on, this ticks all my boxes. This gives me 3 gigawatts of energy that I can do. So it's operating like an inverse gas peaker plant. Rather than whipping up 3 gigawatts of gas peaker plants, I can ramp down 3 gigawatts of Bitcoin mining. And that's what he did. And he tried it out, said, let's see how this goes. I'll just defer purchasing them for now. Bitcoin mining became a core part of the demand response program. And he's like, I don't actually need those gas peaker plants anymore. So Hathaway Energy was not happy.
And not only that, it was the Bitcoin miners who obviously built the infrastructure for Bitcoin, and then in partnership with a renewable energy provider. So essentially saved the state, I don't know how much, but it sounds like a lot of money.
Well, 18 billion just through the gas peaker plants alone. That's without looking at some of the other savings that were possible. Now, it sounds counterintuitive. You said before that this sounds counterintuitive. Well, it doesn't just sound counterintuitive. It is counterintuitive. It's completely counterintuitive that someone who's such a big user of energy could do so much good by not using power. And it sounds counterintuitive. They should be paid for it as well. But this is the reality of how you stabilize grids. The important thing to realize is that it's not just that they have stabilized the variable renewable energy. That's only half the story. The other half of the story is that there is more renewable energy on the grid in the first place that would never have been able to come on if it were not for Bitcoin mining. So number one, there's much more renewable energy on the grid. And number two, when other users of power need that power, Bitcoin mining will power off instantly, because it's also when power demand peaks, so do prices. And when prices peak, it's simply not in Bitcoin mining companies' self-interests or economic interests to continue mining. And how do you get more renewable energy onto the grid in the first place because of Bitcoin mining? Two things. Firstly, Bitcoin mining companies are location agnostic. In other words, they can locate anywhere. So you can't put a hospital anywhere. You can't put an AI data center anywhere. You need to think about latency and internet connection. You can't put a retail business anywhere. Normally, variable renewable energy is put in the place where land is cheap. In other words, the place where there's no people around. Because if there were people around, the land wouldn't be cheap. But here's the problem. We live in a wireless world for the most part, but our energy grids are not wireless, they're wired. I can send you a text message when I'm in Costa Rica and it'll reach you in London. I can't send you energy from Costa Rica to London. Not today, maybe in the future. We need wires. So when you have, for example, in the UK and Scotland, you've got a lot of wind power, but most of the population is not in Scotland. It's in London. It's in England. How do you transport that power? Well, most of it is not getting transported because the grid is aging. So what Bitcoin mining companies are able to do is, rather than most of that wind actually being lost, being squandered, being curtailed, they can locate where the energy source is. And that means that the solar operator or the wind operator has a customer, a permanent customer who can always use that energy. And that's the difference between being economically non-viable and viable. One peer-reviewed study says that if a solar farm, which is 50 megawatts, so that's enough energy for 50,000 people when it's on, if they have no Bitcoin mining, it'll take them 8.1 years to pay off their return on investment. If they have a Bitcoin mining customer who's able to use that energy when other people can't, 3.5 years, they're paid off. And what do they do with that profit? Well, they do what any prudent business owner would do. They expand their business. So they build more solar capacity. They expand their farm from 50 to 75, from 75 to 100. And so this is why we're getting more and more case studies and more peer-reviewed literature saying, yes, this is not theory anymore. We are seeing documented case studies of where Bitcoin mining has accelerated, is accelerating, and will continue to accelerate the green energy transition in a way which otherwise could not be done. It could be done with government subsidies, but it couldn't be done profitably. And that's the key. That's where it's completely different to any other, to battery technology, to green hydrogen, to pumped hydro. All these other techniques are part of the solution. But Bitcoin mining can do it in more cases, more profitably without subsidies.
So we now have enough data, financial data, energy data, consumption data, and we can pull that all into a business case that's fairly emphatically viable. And so how are you finding investors' attitudes towards a Bitcoin mining business case have changed?
Oh, investors,
or have they changed?
The investors' attitudes have. Investors' attitudes have changed a lot, because you now take that to someone who's in infrastructure finance and they will say, okay, so here's a process you go through if you want to get new variable renewable energy onto the grid. Now in the UK right now, there's a wait time sometimes till 2040, sometimes the 2050s to get onto the grid. There's a couple of reasons. Number one is the grid owner doesn't want more variability on the grid because they're having enough trouble counterbalancing it. There's already so much which has been wasted. But also because a lot of that is economically unviable because it doesn't have a customer. And then you have a chicken and egg phenomenon, which is you can't get onto the grid because there's too much in the pipeline and it doesn't have a customer. But because it doesn't have a customer, you can't get into the grid because you can't get financing for it. And Bitcoin mining breaks that chicken and egg by saying, well, you can have a customer even before you get grid interconnected. You can be literally located on the wind farm, on the solar farm, even before it's connected to the grid, earning revenue. And then to your question, an investor will look at that and say, hang on, okay, you actually stack up as something I can finance now because I'm not dependent upon waiting 10 years or 5 years for you to get onto the grid before you have a business case. You have a business case from day one that you're set up. And yes, your business case will improve when you're grid interconnected, but your chances of getting onto the grid are better now because you have a load balancer, because a grid operator can see you're economically you're viable, and I can see that you're economically viable from day one.
It's so compelling. And I know from my previous experience that when you put something in hard numbers and you put that on a chart, you write the business case, documented, you've got your examples in Texas at the very least, that should be turning heads. Are you finding that the tide has turned in terms of writing checks from investors for these kinds of propositions? Are they more receptive to your message? And are operators like Bitcoin miners finding that they are more readily able to partner with renewable energy providers?
Absolutely. We've now got 6 different nation states that are doing Bitcoin mining. All of them are doing it using renewable energy.
Are you able to tell us who they are?
I can remember a few of them off. So China's one of them.
They are?
They're doing a huge amount of Bitcoin
The
mining.
nation state?
Yes, the nation state. Yes.
Wow.
Yep.
Hang on. Are you allowed to tell me this? You're not going to get disappeared or something, hey?
No.
Okay, that's amazing.
I can't tell you the scale, but yes,
Okay.
it's happening at a nation state level.
Okay.
Bhutan is the one that's widely known,
Mhm.
and they have now accumulated the biggest Bitcoin strategic reserve per capita in the world of anyone. In fact, if you look at the countries that have accumulated strategic Bitcoin reserves, the ones who have done it using mining have been able to get it done much faster with less friction than the ones who've tried to do it through purchasing Bitcoin, because they don't have to justify to the population that taxpayer dollars should be used for a speculative asset. The business case is, let's use our surplus hydro energy that would have flowed over the top of the dam, and let's use that. Let's turn water into digital gold. That's alchemy, and that's what Bhutan have done. And now they've raised the payments of every single government official by 50%. They've built a new airport, but they've still been able to save most of that Bitcoin. So that's only been made possible because of mining it and using that for a Bitcoin strategic reserve. So we've got 6 countries at a nation state level who are mining Bitcoin. El Salvador, of course, is another one. We've got 9 different energy companies who are now using Bitcoin. We've got Japan's largest utility, TEPCO. We've got Germany's largest telco, Deutsche Telekom. We've got Cango, the largest auto lender in Hong Kong and Japan, and China, who became a renewable energy provider, who then realized they had to do Bitcoin mining, so they weren't wasting renewable energy. So everyone who ever looks at it very quickly says, well, it's a no-brainer. Our choice is, do we waste our variable renewable energy, or do we use it? And they look at the different use cases. They look at batteries. They look at stored hydro, pumped hydro. They look at the usual suspects, green hydrogen. In some cases, those make more sense. But almost always, 96% of the time, Bitcoin mining is the one that either makes most economic sense or makes sense to combine with battery or to combine with green hydrogen. So it's not a competitor. You can do both. And so that's why you're seeing a proliferation. That's why there's so much more investor interest. And that's why Mara, who I'm an advisor to, recently purchased a wind farm in Texas, and they're doing 114 megawatts, which is a huge amount of energy production, and they're using it for the older Bitcoin mining units, 100% wind powered. So we're seeing this happen more and more. And yes, they have no trouble attracting investment for those sorts of asset purchases, because for them, it marks a transition from being a Bitcoin mining company to now being an energy company, which is a fascinating convergence we're seeing, where Bitcoin mining companies are saying, we need to own the energy assets because then we're not vulnerable to wholesale price fluctuations. And energy companies are converging from the other side, and they're saying, we need to become Bitcoin mining companies, because if we're not, then we're squandering huge amounts of energy, and we want to be more profitable than our competitors. And it's not just renewable operators, it's also oil and gas companies who are doing this. Now, that may sound strange and that may sound not very environmentally friendly, but actually the ironic thing is, it's also counterintuitive. When oil and gas companies use Bitcoin mining, they can use it in a way which is very positive for the environment. And that's because when you're an oil company and you drill for oil, you don't just hit oil, you also hit natural gas in most cases. And what do they do with that natural gas? They burn it.
Hang on, what's the composition of that natural gas, and why do they have to burn that? Because they are compelled to burn that. It's not that they just do it, but so why are they burning that natural gas?
They're burning it because it's too expensive in most cases to build out the gas pipeline. It's going to cost millions of dollars per kilometer to build it out, and they're in the middle of nowhere, and there's just not enough gas to be worth their while, or it's not their primary business model. And they flare it because environmental regulators tell them you can't put it directly into the atmosphere because methane is, to your question, it's mostly methane, sometimes 80, 90% methane. And that directly goes into the atmosphere, and over a 20-year period, methane is 84 times more warming than carbon dioxide. So it's a horrendous greenhouse gas. It's also responsible for 1 million premature deaths through upper and lower respiratory illnesses. It contributes to smog. It's the last thing you want. It's like being in a room with a gas stove which the pilot light has gone out on and staying in that area for a long time. You'd rather it was on so you could do something with that power. You could heat it up. But there's no user for that power out there. There's no gas pipeline, so they just do what the regulator tells them they have to do. They flare it, so they burn it. Now, there's 2 problems with that. The first problem is it looks visually like it's solving the problem, but it's not solving the problem, because flare stacks are not completely burning that methane. They're burning 91%. You might say, well, that's good enough. 9%, that's okay. But remember, the 9% that's still being released directly into the air is 84 times more warming than carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. So 9% of times 84, that's still much worse than 100% carbon dioxide going into the air. So it's a terrible problem. It's a problem which numerous environmental advocacy groups are trying to end gas flaring around the world, but no one's found a way to do it profitably. Well, this is the irony. The one technology that a lot of these very same environmental advocacy groups have been attacking is actually the only way that you can do it profitably. Because if you have a Bitcoin mining data center on that oil field, they can, rather than burning it, they can send that natural gas to a generator. The generator converts that natural gas into electricity. So the molecules become electrons. And then that electricity goes to a hash hut right next door, which has a different meaning from what hash hut meant before you had Bitcoin mining. And no, that's hashing. So these are Bitcoin mining rigs that
powers Bitcoin miners,
that are powering Bitcoin mining. Yeah. And so that'll be happening on the oil field itself. And now 2 things have happened. Number 1, it's no longer wasting energy. And number 2, it's no longer sending a powerful greenhouse gas into the atmosphere.
And those, let's just complete the circle. Those Bitcoin miners are connected either through satellite communications or mobile communications, and it's much easier to send digital signals and connect to the network, to the Bitcoin mining network. And
all you need is a Starlink connection. It doesn't have the same demand of fiber cables that you would have with most AI data centers or HPC, high performance compute.
And suddenly you're monetizing wasted gas and energy into Bitcoin mining and then monetizing that with a Bitcoin block reward. It almost seems like it's so good that it invites skepticism. It's too good to be true, but it actually ticks off all of the boxes.
It really does.
Then it's not something that anybody needs to take our word for. They can get verifiable business cases. If they really want, they can actually build it out themselves. They can go out to one of these energy companies and get a demonstration of how these things work. I mean, I know Bitcoin miners are going out of their way to put sort of videos together about, look what we're doing, look how amazing it is. We're using this kind of energy for Bitcoin mining that would otherwise be wasted. So it's not like this is a closed secret and people are not wanting to share it with the world. They're in fact screaming about it and still being ignored, while there is still essentially like this, I don't want to call it a hysteria, but there is this global sense of urgency about the environment and global warming and how we manage, and there's still, I think, does Europe still have a zero carbon policy?
At this stage, yes.
Yeah, and I know that many countries are starting to review and repeal some of those policies.
I want to touch on that for a minute.
Go ahead.
Because why are they reviewing and repealing? The reason they're reviewing and repealing is not because climate change has gone away as an issue. In fact, quite the opposite. The reason they're renewing and repealing is because the economic consequences of the way those policies have been implemented have been dire, because it has resulted in a lot of subsidies, which has been paid by, in many cases, money printing, or money that could have been allocated to upgrade the grid instead went into new generation. But that generation hasn't been able to reach people, and people have realized these problems. It has resulted in some cases, the power prices going up, because whilst renewable energy is a cheaper form of energy, that's only true when it's able to reach the people. If you have a solar farm where you've spent all this money infrastructure, but it's not reaching people because the transmission lines can't reach them, that's actually more expensive. So a lot of the ways that renewable energy has been attacked, it's not renewable energy that's the problem, it's the way it's been implemented. And so now the government said, well, okay, we've gone too far. We have to keep the people happy. There's a threat of a backlash. Maybe we have to give people cheap energy. But again, you see what's happening? They're having to make a choice between sustainability versus energy affordability and energy security. So they don't have to make that choice. You can keep your zero emission targets, but you can only keep them if you embrace Bitcoin mining. What's happening in Europe at the moment, they're trying to attack Bitcoin mining and keep a net zero target at the same time. It's not possible. You have to have flexible users of energy who can shock absorb that load, who can incentivize more renewables. And we're squandering our best possible chance to do both together.
And it seems to me what's stopping them from doing that is the first fallacy, the initial fallacy, which is energy consumption is
ipso facto bad
for the environment. And that's not necessarily the case.
Well, not only is it not the case, but
Yeah.
it's not even something most people in the environmental movement believe.
Okay, so can you talk to us about that? Because quite often people tend to characterize their opponents not you, but just in
Yeah.
general, opponents by perhaps their most extreme position,
which is degrowthers.
Yeah. And so, you are an environmentalist. You're a proud
Mm-hmm.
environmentalist, right? And you're also a proud Bitcoin too, a staunch Bitcoiner. So can you explain to us, I guess, the spectrum of beliefs in the environmental
Absolutely.
movement?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what's mainstream and what's not?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. It's very easy to lambast your opponents when you've never met one. And I think a lot of the narratives in politics and in the media encourage us to treat environmentalists as this homogenous group who all think the same and all who want less growth and want us to go back to living in some primitive. That's not the case at all. That's a total mischaracterization. Just as it's a total mischaracterization to say that Bitcoiners are all people who don't care for the environment and they just care about number. It's a total mischaracterization.
Number go up, extract.
Yeah. It's a total mischaracterization. And again, politicians and the media have played the part in creating these labels which we've applied that have just stopped us actually embracing and talking to people who might belong to a tribe that feels different to our tribe to start with. So I've seen it happen both ways. I've seen both mischaracterizations. So I can speak to each because I'm part of each tribe. And in the environmental movement, you have this whole, just like within Bitcoin, we have intense debates about things. We don't agree about a whole bunch of things. It's the same within the environmental movement. You have intense debates between people who believe the solution is degrowth, using less energy, going back to a simpler way of living. That's not what most environmentalists believe. Most environmentalists are pragmatists who say, no, that's the days of that are unrealistic. They understand they may not be free marketeers, but they understand we live in a market-driven economy and that if you want to achieve net zero, supply and demand kicks in and you have to have more energy demand. Most environmentalists, I'd say 2/3, get that. And if you look at one of my mentors in this area is a guy called Saul Griffith, who wrote a book called Electrify. And his thesis is very simple and he's very highly regarded in the environmental movement. He says to achieve net zero is possible, but you've got to do it in a pragmatic way. And the way to do it is in 2 stages. Number 1, you have to electrify forms of energy consumption that are currently driven by fossil fuel. So, for example, getting rid of a gas heater or a coal furnace and replacing it with an electrical process. Getting rid of a kiln, which is melting silicon using coal, and replace it with some other process which achieves that same end. Don't know how you do that, but that's the worthy goal. That's step 1. Now, obviously, that's no good if you still have a grid which is predominantly fossil fuel driven, as most grids in the world are today. So in parallel to that, you also have to be swapping out fossil fuel-based sources of grid electrification with renewable sources. So you have to do both together. And he recognizes and he says, well, you're not going to achieve that. You're not going to be able to get more renewables unless you have more people wanting energy. And that's a position that I would say the majority of environmentalists have. But somehow he's got into we've got into what he calls hair shirt environmentalism, which is no, you have to use less energy. You have to be aesthetic. You have to, an ascetic rather. You have to have less and you have to deny. Well, yes, you should switch off the lights at home. You should conserve energy. But overall, usage in a society of energy and economic prosperity have always gone hand in hand. And when you don't have economic prosperity, when you have a downturn, we saw this with COVID. What happened to renewable energy proliferation during the COVID period? It dropped off a cliff because there was no new investment. So economic prosperity, if you have less prosperity, you have less renewable energy generation. So the two have to go hand in hand. And most environmentalists get that. And where I've been able to get through to a lot of environmentalists saying, hey, look, this is the way you achieve what you've always cared about, what you've always dreamed about. This is the way you get, finally, a way we can get more renewable energy onto the grid. And we find a way to counterbalance this intermittency. We don't get a backlash because it's not making energy more expensive for people. It's not creating white elephants in the middle of nowhere. You don't need government subsidies. This is the solution you've always been looking for. And a lot of people have been very receptive to that message.
So we're seeing a lot of activists in the media. When they get attention, there tend to be people like, the Stop Oil activists who defile great pieces of artwork.
Yeah. Again, they do not represent the environmental movement.
But they are part of the environmental movement. And can you tell us a little bit about why they deploy those sorts of methods and how they're generally viewed within the environmental movement?
whenever you have any group of people who care about some cause, whether it's political freedom, whether it's positive economic development, whether it's positive environmental progress, you'll have people who use peaceful means, and history is littered with examples of they tend to do pretty well. People like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi and other great leaders in history who have used peaceful means to achieve transition. And then you have people who use violence and anger and basically acts of terrorism to achieve their ends because they've lost patience with peaceful means, and that seems a more direct way to get results. In fact, history has shown us that it's not. It causes backlashes which are stronger than the original action, because every action has an equal and opposite reaction. And so it's no different in the environmental movement. You have the ones who are prepared to talk to people, to negotiate, to meet the people who they think might be their opponents, to try and get things done, to try and work on common ground. And then you have people who will take to protest and using destructive acts of anger, rage, and violence, which are ultimately counterproductive, but will give them the feeling that they're doing something at the time.
And so do they view all energy consumption as extractive and ultimately going to lead to a bad end for the Earth? So what is their solution? Is to do what exactly?
Well, again, I haven't talked to firsthand to people who defile works of art and spray paint, so I wouldn't want to mischaracterize them. So I would be speculating here, but I think the general thesis is, yes, most of them would be what I call degrowthers, who believe that the solution is to use less energy and that we have to stop all use of oil tomorrow. The reality is, if we did that, that would crash the global economy. And if we crash the global economy, we'd have no new renewable energy generation at all. We'd have just a lot of human suffering.
So that will essentially reduce humanity to subsistence living, if that.
Yeah.
Right.
The other thing that I realized very fast is, like, we're involved in an infrastructure development program, which is looking for landfills where we can deploy Bitcoin mining. And why are we looking at landfills? Because landfills, like oil and gas fields, they also produce methane in huge quantities. And a lot of the world, it's not even flared. It just goes directly into the environment. And if we deployed Bitcoin mining on just 35 landfills, that would offset the emissions of the entire Bitcoin network. That's how huge it is. Lost the train of my thought there. Why was I talking about landfill?
It's all right. We can edit. We can edit this. Yeah. We can.
What was I talking about beforehand?
We were talking about just oil, but I thought you craftily changed the topic.
No. There was a legitimate purpose in going there.
I was going to let you get away with it.
I just can't remember what it was now. What on earth was it? Okay, so I realize this problem, this connection between, if you want to do environmental justice, you have to do social justice. You can't ignore it. And to give an example, so we have an infrastructure investment company. We do methane mitigation on landfills. And how we do that is we use Bitcoin mining as the off-taker for that energy that has basically been wasted. Because on landfills like oil and gas fields, you have methane which gets produced. It's produced through the decomposition of organic waste without the presence of air. And the problem is, in landfills, it's not just flared, it just goes venting directly into the atmosphere. Now, most of the parts of the world that are the biggest challenges, they are countries with lax environmental regulation. They are outside the West. And unfortunately, since the 1980s, we have more authoritarian regimes, not less. We have more unstable political nations, not fewer. And so a lot of the places we really wanted to do landfill projects, we can't. Of course, they're in places like Angola or Haiti, which either don't have political stability, or if we go in there, we have a systemic corruption, which means that you can't do business economically without having to continually either make the choices not to support corruption and deal with the consequences of that, or succumb to it and deal with the consequences of that. And so there's a whole lot of places in the world we just can't mitigate methane because of social unrest, political unrest, or authoritarian regimes. So it's critically important that to address these environmental challenges, we address the humanitarian challenges at the same time. And if you're in a country which is falling apart economically, has hyperinflation, again, you can't do business there. It just doesn't have the amount of economic stability. So it's critical that we have to do all three together. You need economic prosperity, we need political freedom, and we need environmental action. And if you don't have those first two, it's very, very hard to have environmental action.
And there is a relationship between energy consumption, prosperity, human flourishing, and as well.
It's been well proven over time. There's no such thing as an energy poor, economically rich country.
Low energy consuming,
Yep.
rich country. It just doesn't happen. And that's a fairly tight correlation as well.
Mm.
And I guess that relationship possibly gets only stronger with artificial intelligence and the intense high energy demands that.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about that because we're now seeing a lot of Bitcoin mining companies either add artificial intelligence data warehouses to their operations, and maybe one or two have even said, we're spinning that off and we're just going towards that because it's a more lucrative industry. Is that a threat to the industry, do you think?
It's actually great for the industry. It's another form of convergence. So in the same way that you're getting energy companies and Bitcoin mining companies converging from both ends, the same is actually happening from both ends with AI and Bitcoin. Now we hear about what you've just described, which is when Bitcoin mining companies either become AI companies or become hybrids. But it's also happening the other way around, where AI companies are realizing that to get contracts with the grid, they have to have a certain proportion of their load being dedicated to Bitcoin mining. And I'll talk about why it's happening in both directions. When you're in Bitcoin mining, it's very important that you have a secondary source of income because Bitcoin is highly volatile. And if the price of Bitcoin is low and the hash rate is high, then your hash price, which is what Bitcoin mining companies live and die by, that's how much in US dollars you're basically earning per day based on your hash rate. If that's low, then you don't have a viable business. So if you have a secondary source of revenue, then suddenly you're anti-fragile. So that secondary source could be that you have an AI component. It could be that you sell some proprietary technology. It could be that you sell demand response services to the grid. It could be renewable energy credits or carbon credits. It could be heat recycling revenue. Doesn't matter what it is, but you have to have some secondary revenue, and this is a pivot which all the successful Bitcoin mining companies are now taking. So one of them is AI, because it makes sense. You already understand data centers, you understand cooling. It's natural to get into AI. The other way around is when AI data centers, what's the big problem they have? Well, typically the hyperscalers, Microsoft, Google's, Amazon's, they have big cash balances. They have the ability to pay a higher price for energy. It's not so critical. Number one, because of their cash balance, but number two, because unlike a Bitcoin mining company where 80% of their operating costs is power, where an AI data center maybe 30% top. So it's not as important how much they pay for energy. But the struggle they're getting and the pushback they're getting, and in fact, there was one company, one of the large three hyperscalers, who was, the Irish grid said no to them recently, was that the grid operators are concerned because of what we talked about beforehand. You have an inflexible user of energy on your grid, and you have a grid operator who's trying to decarbonize. Well, that's the last thing they want. So if that AI data center now has even 3% of their power going into Bitcoin mining, basically like a shock absorber, that's enough. The entire business can now be considered flexible load. So now when they go to a grid operator and they say, well, what can you do for us apart from pay some money? They can say, well, we're a flexible load consumer. We can shut off 3% of our load, and that can help you to stabilize the grid. Now, obviously, they'd prefer 100%, but 3% is often enough. Because the other thing that happens is when you have a large new load that comes onto the grid, or you have renewable energy generation that comes onto the grid, either one of those can trigger the need to upgrade the grid, to build new substations, to regulate voltage, and it all costs a lot of money. What's been shown recently at Duke University is if an AI data center has even that 3% component of Bitcoin mining, that's enough that the grid operator will not have to upgrade the grid to the tune of tens of millions of dollars, sometimes hundreds of millions of dollars.
And are AI data center operators embedding that 3% into their operations for
We're
Bitcoin
just starting
mining, or
to
they
see
just
the
started
evaluation.
Okay.
It's just starting. So this is the new trend I'm picking.
And so what's the potential scale for that? Because we know the demand for AI is just starting, and it's already incredibly big, right? So I'm starting to use it in so many things, and I'm scaling up my demand for AI compute. I've barely even started. So I imagine that a lot of industries in a similar position, and that's going to accelerate in the next 18 months, 2-3 years. And so what's the potential scale, perhaps, if you can just, I don't know if you can, relative to the size of Bitcoin miners, for
It's going to
example?
dwarf Bitcoin mining. AI doesn't draw as much for the same land footprint as Bitcoin mining, but the sheer scale at which if projections are correct and it keeps on going, it may not be correct. There may be some technology breakthroughs that mean we don't need to use as much energy. But if the projections are correct, it's going to dwarf Bitcoin mining. And a lot of environmentalists have been rightly concerned and said, well, that doesn't sound good because they're an inflexible energy user and that's going to require grids to put more fossil fuel on them. But the great hope is that if the AI data center truly recognizes the benefit of being a flexible load, then they can go with Bitcoin mining as a proportion of their computational load. Their electricity draw goes into Bitcoin mining. That's good for them because it helps them get onto the grid. It helps them find contracts. Good for the grid operator because they can defer costs. And it's good for the environment because now that allows the grid operator to say, well, we can handle more renewable energy onto our grid. We can meet this demand with wind, solar, hydro, maybe thorium modular nuclear reactors rather than coal and other fossil fuels.
Why do you think AI has not drawn the same level of criticism for its appetite for
It's
energy?
starting to.
Do you think so?
Not to the same extent, though, you're right.
Yeah, I mean,
not
I
nearly
see
to the
it.
same extent.
It's like very aggressive whenever energy consumption and Bitcoin mining are mentioned. With AI, it's just like a passing thing, as if like, oh, there's this wonderful societal good coming, and yeah, it's energy intensive.
Well,
I don't
I'll
see
give you
the
an
same
example.
level of vitriol. There's no
there's
paid
not.
campaign against it. I don't see coalescing of the environmental movement, or Greenpeace, let's just say, against artificial intelligence and its requirement for energy. So I'm just wondering, like, why do you think that is? Why do you think there's...
Well, I can tell you exactly why it is.
Okay.
So my background is spending 25 years in working with disruptive technologies, either starting up technology companies or investing in them. And so you get to see what happens with disruptive technologies and the technology adoption cycle they go through. Now, a disruptive technology means by definition you're disrupting someone or some entity. And if you look through history with what's happened with these disruptive technologies, it's always the same pattern. We had it at our own company where we had a disruptive technology which allowed molecular biologists to have access to high-end bioinformatics tools which help them do analysis on things like viruses much faster than they could if they didn't have access to those tools. And we had an incumbent technology which costed roughly 50 times as much and was slower. It required much more complicated hardware. Now, do you think they just said, oh, well, our day's done, we'll pack up and go and we'll welcome in and usher in this new technology? Of course they didn't. They had one thing we didn't have. They had an entrenched position. They had a big customer base. And they had a lot of power and leverage to use their incumbency to spread information about us that, let's just say, wasn't completely accurate, such that when we would go and talk to new potential users of our technology, they'd already heard about us from the incumbent. And most of it was nonsense, or all of it was nonsense, in fact. And we just realized, this is just a rite of passage. Whenever you do something disruptive, the incumbent will always use these tactics to keep their position. And we've seen this through history. So we saw this with the bicycle, the automobile, the radio, the internet. Any industry that is disintermediated will do anything in their power to maintain their existing position. AI data centers do not disintermediate major powerful industries. Bitcoin does. It disintermediates the need for central banks. Very powerful institution. It means less power for the International Monetary Fund. Very powerful institution. It means that banking is not, and in a world where Bitcoin has become money is a world where you are your own bank. So segments of the banking sector, financial services and intermediaries, people responsible for remittance payments who've enjoyed that privileged position are all threatened with disintermediation. Now, who are the people who've been most aggressive and putting out information about Bitcoin which says that it's bad for the environment? Central banks and the International Monetary Fund and competing altcoins.
Altcoins, plural?
One in particular.
Who?
If you look to the funders of the Greenpeace USA Change the Code campaign, that received a $5 million donation from Chris Larsen, who is the executive chair of Ripple.
That's really interesting because you have these lifelong committed environmentalists actively ignoring hard data, case studies, and emerging academic studies as well. That's highlighting the benefits of Bitcoin mining for the environment, energy security, which enables a lot of the social justice, the economic social justice at the very least. And they're ignoring that for a $5 million check. And I wonder what sort of consequences that has had for a lot of people. Because we saw, if you recall, that beautiful piece of art that was commissioned by Greenpeace that we sort of Bitcoiners took as and made it our own because it was just so beautiful.
Yep.
And that the artist who created that sort of skull chimney thing had second thoughts because he was really, I think he was taken aback at first. He didn't realize what the situation really was.
No, he didn't.
And credit to him, I forget his name, but he was really quite open to the feedback. And I think enough Bitcoiners, enough Bitcoiners were sort of commenting with a reasonable tone that he invited feedback, and he was really quite receptive about that. Was it you that had
I was one of the
dialogue
people who
with
had
him?
a dialogue with him.
Yeah.
It was initiated by Troy Cross. So Troy Cross, myself, and one other person who goes under a pseudonymous Twitter handle, Level 39, were involved in a dialogue with him. And what happened was he had spent a lot of time receiving one side of the story, which was from Greenpeace USA. As a result of hearing that, he believed that environmentalism and Bitcoin advocacy were incompatible. If they were Venn diagrams, there would be no intersection. He then very rarely realized very fast that there was a large and very passionate environmental community who were also Bitcoiners. And so that created some cognitive dissonance. And he also realized that there were some very legitimate use cases where Bitcoin was net positive to the environment. And he came out and he said, well, I thought it was a black and white issue. How wrong am I? So he didn't become an advocate for Bitcoin as a force for good for the environment, but he said, hey, look, I'm taking a second look at that. I think I took a stance which was very black and white, and I'm now reevaluating this. And that was as a result of exactly what we talked about earlier, which was he had mischaracterized an entire community of people to imagine they were homogenous and found out that they weren't. But that was only possible through dialogue. Now, to Greenpeace USA's credit, and many Bitcoin miners would say they deserve none, but I have a different take. I don't hate anyone. I will dialogue with anyone. And so I had a dialogue with the campaign leader from the Change the Code campaign. I can't say what we said because that was Chatham House rules, the nature of that conversation. But what I will say is he was receptive to hearing what I had to say. I came away knowing without any doubt whatsoever that he believed he was doing the right thing. He really did believe it. I also know that when he found out that I shared exactly the same environmental values as him, but had come to some very different conclusions, then that was a moment of cognitive dissonance for him. And I can't talk about the circumstances, but what I can say is that within 2 months of our second conversation, he left the campaign. And so when you dialogue with people who seem to be part of a different tribe, I think it's absolutely critical to reach out across the divide and to look for more similarities and differences. And you find out that he's just another person, another human being who's wanting to make his mark in the world and do something in accordance with his values. But our values can be manipulated. And his values very clearly had been manipulated by a group of people who had perpetuated a message which he had accepted as true, as had I. when I first came to Bitcoin. And that's when I looked at him, I thought, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Because, confession time, when I first looked at Bitcoin, my reaction was the same. I thought, this is bad for the environment. And it wasn't my intellectual humility that led me to a different conclusion. It was luck. It was the luck that I happened to have a friend who challenged me. And if I hadn't had that, then I wouldn't have had the opportunity to take a second take and to say, no, let's actually research this. Let's not depend on the information sources I'm getting. And thank goodness I didn't, because it turned out that the information sources I was getting was the media, and the media's information source was a non-peer reviewed commentary, 5 pages long, written by a central banker. And it turned out that when I looked at the data in there, as others had before me, the data was inaccurate, old, incomplete, cherry-picked, and the methodology was flawed. And that one study, not even a peer-reviewed full-length article, became the basis of an entire narrative in the media that Bitcoin is bad for the environment.
Can you tell us who the author was of that paper?
Alex DeVries.
Okay.
Yeah.
And for some reason, people keep referring to that paper over and over again, ignoring perhaps dozens of examples of refutation with references being cited, quite extensive refutations as well. Why do you think that persists? Like, you have to actively want to ignore the opposing viewpoint to continually reference a particular paper.
I don't think it's as sinister as that. I think it's more that I used to tell people for a long time, like I was working with people, helping them to pitch for capital, to do presentations, or doing leadership training, and I told them that you should do this thing called a power pose, and that it had been proven scientifically to elevate the testosterone levels, reduce the cortisol levels. And then I found out there was no academic basis to that, so I stopped telling people that. Right, so I'm sorry. I don't. Okay, maybe it works for the placebo effect, but there was no ability to reproduce that paper. In the meantime, though, that had become the second most watched TED Talk of all time, and there are still people out there. It's like Brandolini's law. It takes 10 times the energy to counteract misinformation as to create it in the first place. So there's nothing sinister in what I was doing. I was trying to help people, and I realized that I was actually saying something that was not.
But that sounded good, right? It sounded good because it's quite a domineering pose, and you think surely that's
and look, it may have worked simply by the placebo effect. So, so I don't feel like I've done any harm. The problem here is that environmentalists are actually doing harm unwittingly, because by maligning Bitcoin based on misinformation, you are stopping the technology which has more power than any other technology to accelerate the green energy transition and to mitigate methane. That's harm. And so that's why it's so important that we counteract this. But I don't think it's the people who are doing this, the environmental movements, they're not doing anything sinister. They're doing what they believe to be the right job. There are some bad actors who are intentionally putting out misinformation. Most of the people are simply doing what I was, which is thinking they're reporting or informing, but in fact are spreading something which is dangerously inaccurate.
So is there a space here for environmentalist Bitcoiners? And I'm not suggesting that anybody I'm not giving anybody homework, but is there a space here to be more active in educating or lobbying environmental activist groups about the benefits of Bitcoin, rather than waiting and reacting to them taking a negative stance once they've been recipients of misinformation about Bitcoin? And I wonder how, do you think that's an opportunity, and how could that be done? Like, because I'm sure there are environmentalist Bitcoiners watching this. And so...
Look, I'm totally up for it. Anytime, I'm happy to talk to anyone at all. I don't care what their starting position is. And nor do I have any investment on whether they change their minds, because that's arrogant. They may know something that I don't know. I mean, I haven't encountered that yet. I always listen to everyone's arguments on their merits. I can just put my hand on my heart and say I haven't heard anything from an opposing view yet which has been well informed. But if I do, and if something changes and suddenly there's a big Bitcoin mine that's powered by coal that I don't know about, then yeah, that's going to change my position too. But that's not the case at the moment. The case at the moment is that Bitcoin is gravitating towards more renewable energy, more sustainable energy, and is helping to solve a lot of climate problems. So I'm always open to talking to different groups. Like I say, no one's my enemy here. I try not to operate in a way which is tribal, and maybe don't always succeed, but for the most part, I'm interested in truth and in learning, and just understanding people's perspectives.
In having said that, I mean, I know in our discussions you've told me you do a fair amount of presentations and advocacy work as well. So can you give us a little bit of an insight into the types of organizations and people you are speaking to? You don't have to name names if you don't want to, but just the types and what sort of questions they're asking, what are their concerns, and has their reception to your message, has that changed in the time that you've been active in this space? Because I'm really, one of the things that I'm really fascinated by is the change in attitudes and what is the catalyst for that. And I wonder if you can share some insights on that, because I'm really fascinated by that.
So the community of people that I talk to ranges from, at one end of the continuum, like I say, would be someone who's actively fighting and putting funding money behind attacking Bitcoin, such as Greenpeace USA. I've engaged with those people. A less extreme stance might be an ESG fund, might be a consortium of family offices, might be a pension fund or a sovereign fund, talking to chief investment officers or advisors to those funds, or the principals of family offices who want to invest in Bitcoin because it makes economic sense, because they've recognized that it is the apex asset, but they don't believe that it's consistent with the values of their fund. And they want to tick an ESG box, either because it's an inconvenience and it's about optics, but equally as often because they genuinely care about doing the right thing by the planet. And they cannot put their hand on their heart and say that they are with Bitcoin. And so I'll talk to them and I'll say, look, I share this set of values. It sounds like you have a similar set of values. Here's why I am not only comfortable with investing in Bitcoin, but would frankly say that if you have a fund which wants to do something good for the environment and you don't invest in Bitcoin, that's a lost opportunity. And the sort of responses I get are extremely positive. Once I'm down and I'm actually talking to a group of people or one-on-one, they're extremely positive. When it's on Twitter, when it's a social media interaction, not so much so, because it's easy to forget there's a person behind the message, and you don't know, you're not eyeballing the person, so you don't know what their intention is.
And they don't know who you are.
They don't know who I am. Yeah. So once they understand, and there's a bit of legitimate suspicion, what's in it for you? Why are you doing this? Is it for your own self-interest? All those usual things, which is the same suspicions I would have. Once they can see, actually, this person was an environmentalist for 20 years. You can't fake that stuff. This person, his friends still are at Greenpeace Aotearoa in New Zealand. You can't fake that stuff. This guy, took environmental actions with Greenpeace and Native Forest Action. Then he started a climate tech fund. Then he started another one. And then he was looking for a problem to methane. Then he landed on Bitcoin, decided it's part of the solution. Okay, that's different from what I believe. Maybe I should listen to what he says. So that's, I think, because of my just who I am and my background, that creates a receptivity to listen. Doesn't mean they're going to change their point of view, but it creates a receptivity. And then, of course, I've taken some time to research it from the same lens and starting point they are, which is just objectively, is this good for the environment or not? I can walk people through the steps and the journey that I went through to saying, yes, actually, this is definitely going to be net positive.
I really like your approach to this whole issue, because you approach it with empathy, and I know empathy, as of late, at least in American political discourse, has kind of got a bad name, as if it's synonymous with weakness. Yeah. And I think, no, you've got to be strong and in order to just, display empathy.
Yeah, one of the political leaders I admire the most is Narendra Modi. We were talking about this before. I was listening to his interview with Lex Friedman. It's an incredible interview. And you realize that he's a very humble, very softly spoken man, very empathetic. And he also looks at everything on merits. He had so many advisors during COVID telling him to print more money. And he listened to them all. He took on board their perspective. Then he talked to some other people. Then he thought about what it would do to the person on the street. He thought about businesses. He thought about the consequences of everything. He thought about the longitudinal consequences of printing a lot of money and how it could lead to high inflation. And he decided not to do that. And he was criticized roundly. And in fact, India's economy did shrink more than other economies because of that. But they came out of COVID in much better economic shape. And now they're growing at 7% per year. They didn't experience any of that high inflation. And it's because of his empathy, his ability to look at things, and no matter how expert some economist was, to say, well, okay, that's one perspective. What's the other perspective? And those are the sorts of people I always attempt to emulate.
You mentioned, we were discussing your advocacy work before and speaking to various stakeholders. Do you find attitudinal differences across countries and continents towards Bitcoin? Some are more advanced than others, or are there any nuances that you found interesting?
Yeah, there are. So I've lived in New Zealand and Costa Rica. I spent a lot of time in both Europe and the United States, less time recently, although it's going to change. There are differences. In Europe, what I'm learning more and more is that both the political left and right seem to like more government involvement, which is interesting. Generally in America, they're much more hands-off. New Zealand tends to be somewhere in the middle, and Costa Rica's pura vida. As long as life is good, then no one really gives much attention to government. As long as your power's still on, which it is less of the time now because of government bureaucracy, but that's another story. But when it comes to Bitcoin, people have different reasons. So for Costa Rica, for example, why did Costa Rica embrace Bitcoin early? Because it did.
Tell us more about that.
So what happened in Costa Rica was it solved a problem which other countries didn't have, and that is that a number of businesses, they were operating from Costa Rica, but most of their business was coming from the United States, and so there were remittance payments coming in, and every time a remittance payment came in, they were getting these really large fees that was basically eating away 10-20% of their profit. And I met with a couple of business owners who embraced Bitcoin way back in 2013. And they said, yeah, we went to Bitcoin early. He was a guy who'd done a lot of programming. He looked at it as a technologist. He said, yeah, it solved a problem because it allowed us to get money into the country and be more profitable and expand our business. And then I talked to another person in Costa Rica, and Costa Rica has a lot of renewable energy. It's mainly hydro-based. And because it's mountainous, so you have gravity, and it's tropical, so it rains a lot. It's a good combination for hydro. And it's also a good combination for micro hydro. So I met a guy who had started up a 1 megawatt hydro facility on his land, and it was 60 hectares of beautiful land. He had a national reserve upstream of him, and every stereotype of Costa Rica. He had all the monkeys and snakes and iguanas and everything on his property, and he had horses and geese, and it was just a beautiful property. But he almost lost it because during COVID, what happened was the state-owned utility said, well, we've had an economic downturn, therefore people aren't using so much energy, therefore we don't need your power. And he lost his contract with the state-owned utility to supply hydropower to the grid overnight. And so suddenly a cash cow turned into a white elephant because he still had a mortgage on the hydro facility. And it was such a high mortgage and he'd lost his revenue, so he was on the point where he was going to have to lose his land, do a mortgagee sale. And it was only because his son-in-law said, well, have you looked at Bitcoin mining? That he said, well, what's that? How does that work? Had said, isn't that some scam? And the son-in-law said, no, it's quite legitimate. But Bitcoin mining is really energy hungry and it can locate anywhere. He was like, okay, let's try this out. And he got a couple of ASICs and ran it. And then he was sitting in the cafe and he said, hey, I'm getting paid. Well, and he did some calculations. He said, well, if I used a full megawatt of ASICs, then I'd get paid quite a lot. That's what he did. And he managed to get a bank loan. He managed to get a permit to put these ASICs on his property. And then he had to actually connect it to the grid because the state-owned utility wouldn't let him do it unless it was called backup power. So he had to put a little wire connecting it to the grid and keep that there just to say it's backup power just in case the grid ever needed it. But that permitted him to do his Bitcoin mining on site.
He was not allowed to generate his own electricity unless it was he connected it to the grid.
Even though the grid said they don't want it, they're not going to pay for it. But just in case they needed it in some emergency.
Yeah, don't do anything unless it's good for us.
But the Costa Ricans are good at working their way around regulations, as parts of Southern Europe are as well, I believe. including
Definitely.
Portugal, where I was recently. So they worked their way around the regulations. He did it, and basically it saved his property. And it was using what would have been completely wasted hydro energy. And he then turned his place into this eco sanctuary, and it's beautiful. It's he has kids who come through it who do zip lining, and they do retreats there. He does corporate events there. It's an incredible place, and it was all enabled, and he would have lost his land if it was not for Bitcoin mining. So Costa Rica has its own ways they use it. And what you find is you just find more and more of these stories as you meet more people. Some people from the mining angle, some people from the business angle, but they've all got their story of how they got into it. And then Uvita, another place in Costa Rica, where a guy called Francis who set up, he was from Montreal originally. He came to this tiny little township, 3,000 people on the coast, Pacific coast. And he just started talking to local merchants about the advantage of Bitcoin. And they were like, hey, this sounds great. We could transact using this. It's instantaneous. There's no fees. It's peer-to-peer. There's no middleman. Yeah, let's do this. And now Uvita has the highest concentration of business owners accepting Bitcoin of anywhere in the world.
Really?
Really?
So,
Yeah.
like,
Bitcoin jungle, man, pura vida.
we always compare El Zonte Beach.
Yeah.
You're saying it's got a high concentration than
It's
El Zonte
small.
Beach?
It's
Bitcoin Beach,
3,000 people, so I'll put it in perspective. But of that, there's a higher penetration of businesses using it than any other community of people in the world right now.
And they actually use it?
Oh yeah, I've transacted there. I went and visited there, and they use it. You see the Bitcoin sign up at many businesses.
So if I go up to a counter and want to pay for my restaurant bill, it's not just a marketing exploit.
Not at all. No, you can actually do it. I've bought ice cream there. I've bought falafels there. Yeah.
Falafels in Costa Rica.
Falafels in
Okay,
Costa
that
Rica.
sounds quite
Yep,
exotic.
yep.
Is there a large Lebanese contingent in Costa Rica?
They didn't look Lebanese. I think they're just diversified.
What's life like there? Because, I guess I've been to El Salvador, and I may have told you just before I went to El Salvador, a friend of mine, she went to Costa Rica and absolutely fell in love with it. But we don't really hear too many stories about Bitcoin in Costa Rica, and as a result, what life is like in Costa Rica. I know that Jack Dorsey at one point, he was tweeting about it with his Pura Vida tweet, and but it's kind of gone quiet. It didn't have a groundswell of news flowing out of there. Or maybe I'm just out of the loop. But tell me what's life like there? What drew you to live in Costa Rica?
Well, there's a couple of things. So there's one thing else I need to shout out, and that's the work that the Reynolds Foundation are doing and that Alvaro is doing. Because one consequence of what happened in El Salvador when so many gang members were rounded up and put into prison, not all of them made it into prison. Some of them escaped across borders, and some of them came to Costa Rica. And so one of the bits of collateral damage that was caused during that was that Costa Rica now has more narcotics cartels than it used to. And what they will typically do is they'll go to these schools and they'll, front up, and they'll have people with their, the smart gear and then the Nike caps and shoes, looking good and driving a nice car, and say, hey, would you like to have a lifestyle like this to 16-year-old kids? And say, well, why struggle? And, there's no economic opportunity in this town, but hey, join us, come with us. And they recruit actively, and a lot of kids get into these cartels through school. And the only way to counteract that is through showing there's a better path, and the work the Reynolds Foundation has done. Part of the work has been to go to these schools and teach them about financial freedom, to teach them about taking sovereignty of your own future, and also teach them about Bitcoin and how you can use that as part of the solution. So they've done some fantastic work. Why did I go to Costa Rica? It wasn't for the beaches, it was for the trash heaps.
Is that right? So you're in search of an investment opportunity for...
There were three reasons. My business partners are in the States, so I wanted to be in the same time zone. I was going to increasingly to more and more events to talk about Bitcoin mining and environmental benefits. Most of them were in the States and Europe. So New Zealand was a long way to travel. And the third reason was that, there's a lot of landfills that we wanted to do methane mitigation projects on, and a lot of them were in Latin America. And so it's like, okay, well, could be El Salvador, could be Peru, could be Costa Rica, and that turned out to be a good place to raise a family. So that's where we are.
Are they all learning Spanish? They speak Spanish in Costa Rica?
See.
Yeah. Well, okay, I'll excuse you for not being proficient in Spanish, but children tend to be immersed in the local life much quicker.
They're excelling me.
Are they at the point of ridiculing you for your Spanish?
Oh, they reached that point after a few days.
Bless. So what's up next for you, Daniel? Because you've moved to Costa Rica. You're well and truly embedded into like the Bitcoin mission. It seems that most of your life's interests have sort of coalesced around Bitcoin. And so what else are you looking for in the investment space, in the Bitcoin space,
well,
in the environmental
yeah,
sort of
I think there's
movement as
one
well?
thing that hasn't quite coalesced yet, and it's the one thing that we haven't talked about yet was, and this has actually been key to me being able to keep a clear mind whilst often dealing with the same objections to Bitcoin over and over again and still maintaining empathy, and that's having a meditation practice.
Yeah, we spoke about that earlier today.
Yeah.
You know, it's like, I don't meditate, but I do, you know, when I'm trying to fall asleep, sort of engage in some breathing techniques, but they only seem to work when I don't need them. You know, when my body's burning up and the cortisol is high, or I've got a burning issue on my mind.
It can work the other way as well, you know. Sometimes I was the other way around. I only used it when I was in a terribly low state, and as soon as I was back to equilibrium, I don't need it anymore. So it can work the other way.
So why is that a problem? Because you fall out of the habit.
It's a problem because it's like saying, well, I've achieved equilibrium, but life's not just about equilibrium. Life's about excelling, and so I'd abandoned a technique that if I kept on using it could have taken me to even higher levels of energy. And it took me about 4 years to work that out. It's like the goal is not to get back to par. The goal is to excel.
Isn't there, I guess, a diminishing return to a practice where you go, it can bring you up to par, and then beyond that, is the effort really worthwhile? Like, how much incrementally are you going to get above that?
It gets more, because it's not a journey from 1 to 10, it's a journey from 1 to infinity.
Wow. Is it though? I mean, that sounds really good, but is it really? Lay it out for me, because I don't quite get that.
Yeah. So when I first got into breathing techniques, I learned this technique about 24 years ago called Sudarshan Kriya. And it was incredible because, I'll be honest, I didn't want to be there particularly. It was only my partner at the time who dragged me there. And I went to the intro talk and I said to the person conducting, yeah, I'll go along. And I checked it out. But it was mind-blowing because it helped me to get rid of a whole lot of grief that I had for someone I'd lost in my life that I carried with me for 7 years. And I just felt amazing. And all that grief just instantly transformed into gratitude for the person's presence in my life for when they were there. And so that was something I didn't know was possible. And I just felt this surge of energy, and then I promptly forgot the techniques after about 40 days. But then I came back to it when I'd kind of gone down in my energy levels again and started doing this meditation. And it was phenomenal because it gave me just a huge amount of energy. And I think sometimes as adults, we just assume that adulthood is about entropy, where we start off with a lot of energy as a kid and then gradually it's a downhill slope. Now, of course, the body ages. There's no way to really reverse that at the moment. But it doesn't mean our energy levels need to dissipate, or our life enthusiasm, or our sense of humor, or else the smile on our face should dissipate. You know, we should be able to still maintain that. And through that meditation, I just noticed I felt more enthusiastic, more energetic, and then I was trying to get capital to raise a company at the time, and I was just failing abysmally. But as soon as I'd done that meditation program, I noticed I had more energy. I was engaging more effectively with people. My communication improved, which kind of makes sense now because your communication can only be as clear as your mind. And if your mind's not clear, then your communication won't be clear. And so having a clearer mind gave me clearer communication. That seemed to be quite a good way to gain capital. So there were a number of benefits, and I also met my wife shortly afterwards. We've been together for more than 20 years. So it's just been a gradual journey where the more that I've committed to doing more of it, the more that I notice that I can take on challenges that otherwise I would have just never taken on. Like to be honest, like this is my day. So I wake up in the morning, I do my breathing, yoga, meditation. I see my kids off to school on the school bus. I have my breakfast. I open up my laptop and I say, right, who's written what about Bitcoin and energy, Bitcoin and the environment, Bitcoin and sustainability, and Bitcoin and renewable energy? And one day out of 3, there'll be someone who's written some new misinformation about Bitcoin and energy. I was like, okay, here we go. And it's a little bit like being on the front lines, defending a technology that you believe in deeply, but still maintaining empathy for. There's a human being at the end of that who's written that, believing they're doing, for the most part, believing they're doing something good, or they're doing the right thing, or they're communicating or conveying something to other people of value and merit, for the most part.
You're more charitable than I am.
I know.
I think some of it is malicious.
Some of it is. Some of it is. But at least I start with that assumption until proven wrong. And then I'll say, right, well, what are my options? I'll engage with a journalist. I'll see if I can form a direct connection with them. I'll see if they're intellectually curious to having that position challenged. And maybe 1 out of 10 journalists will actually retract it. 1 out of 5 might respond. But the ones who don't, at least they'll think twice about putting out opinions which are factually incorrect in the future. And nor will they be able to believe in the future that it's impossible to be a Bitcoiner and an environmentalist. That's not something that I could have done in that volume with that level of calmness if it wasn't for a pretty heavy dosage of breathing and meditation. So it's been essential. It's allowed me to take on new challenges. That's why I say it's not a journey from 1 to 10. I think it's allowed me to take on greater responsibilities, and neither to go into the false humility of who am I to do this, but nor into the arrogance of believing that I'm some struggler and that it's all up to me and I have to do it and take on, so that responsibility doesn't become a burden.
When you go through your morning routine, does that always bring you to the same place mentally and emotionally? Or
no.
That's what
no,
so
no, not at all.
And so I wonder whether or not you'd be the same whether you did that or not.
Well, I tried. I ran the split test, and for about 4 years, because I have a pretty scientific mindset, so I tried for a long time, trying to go without it and trying to go with it. And I remember there was a couple of things that happened. When I was running my technology company, I've been doing the breathing technique consistently, and then I thought, I think it's not making much difference anymore, and I missed a day. That was the day I had an argument with my co-founder, and I literally could feel that in the past I'd be hearing some of his language and some of his expression. I'd be able to deal with it calmly and cool the conversation. Now I could feel myself getting drawn in. I could feel my ego getting involved. I could feel I wanted to fight. I was like, who are you to? And it was really the ego. So it's been great at just keeping that ego in check and making sure that more often, I don't always get it right, but more of the time I'm responding with empathy than with ego. Yeah. So I've seen where I go through the times over a 4-year period when I missed it, and it was a pretty stark difference.
I kind of feel the same way about working out. If I've like usually I'd work out 4, 5, sometimes 6 days a week, but if I go 2 or 3 days where I'm supposed to work out and not work out, there's just a build-up of tension.
You can feel the difference, right?
Yeah.
And you know yourself well enough. It's
like,
okay, I don't need to run this experiment anymore.
And it's a really good state if I was playing a competitive sport, for example, but it's not a really good state to be in just day to day, because there's just this edge of energy, anxiety, and I guess jumpiness. It's not so much anxiety makes it sound like I'm fearing something that's just around the corner. I don't feel that way, but there's a jumpiness, there's an excess of energy. Mental, physical, emotional. I just feel like
it's got to be deployed somewhere, right?
Yeah, I really do feel that way. And I'm a high energy person with a low or laid back sort of personality though. So there's a contrast there. So you think meditation, of course you would think meditation would help me, but it's one of those things like, you know how when I wake up...
Well, it depends what you want. I mean, look, here's the thing. There's a lot of people who've been very happy, very successful. They've never needed to meditate. That's not the point. It's for me, it's now a point of I run my life, I try to, with a sense of wonder, where I'll look at something new that I would have dismissed in the past at face value, and I've learnt that doesn't work out so well. And meditation was one of these things I almost dismissed, but because of other people seeing things I didn't, I was able to experience that. So I thought, okay, I would have dismissed that from the outside, not having experienced it, but let's experience it first. As long as it's not going to do me harm. If it's going to do me harm, then I might not do that. But if it's going to, or I won't do that. But if it's going to be something that's the worst that can happen is not that bad, I just lose a little bit of time, then okay, I'll experiment. I'll give that a go. I'll see what the consequence will be. And then I'll defer judgment until I've experienced something. And I've tried to adopt that approach with Bitcoin, with meditation, with yoga, with anything. And it's caused me to open up and just experiment with things I otherwise might never have done. And it's proven to be a good approach because it's expanded my horizons rather than shrinking them. So I think it's about we all find out what works for us. But if we as adults can keep that sense of childlike curiosity, that sense of wonder, I wonder what this would be like. We don't have to go in. It doesn't have to be, oh, if I do this and I have to do this for the rest of my life. You don't know. So it's just, oh, try it out, see what happens and treat it playfully and see whether it, and that's what I'd say to anyone. It's like, but if you're going to learn meditation, don't just learn it from an app. Go and actually do a proper course with someone who knows how to guide you into it. Do it for 40 days and then make a before and an after assessment and say, okay, now I'm in a position, like going to the gym. Don't just get an app and, do some press ups at home. Actually get some instruction or go to a gym or make a commitment to go for 40 days and then do a stock take on how you think you feel or how you do feel before and afterwards. And now you're in a position to notice some differences. Whereas I think a lot of people, whether it's a gym, whether it's meditation, if they don't notice an instantaneous difference, they'll give up. And that's not realistic for anything which has value. It's a little bit like investing per se. You invest some money, whether it's into Bitcoin, whether it's into stocks and real estate, the net consequence of that investment is actually you have less liquidity straight away for the most part. You have less, not more, because you haven't experienced the growth. Or it's Bitcoin, it might draw back. But the idea is you draw out your time horizon. You think, no, well, who cares whether it's down per month or per 6 months? What's it doing over 6 years? What's it doing over 4 years? And that's where I think there's a similarity between meditation and Bitcoin. It's the same thing. You don't look at it by a day or a week or a month, but what's been the difference in my life after incorporating this over a year, over 2 years, over 4 years? When you look at the volatility of life, you're not going to feel better every single day. Some days will be down. You might be down for a month relative, but if you keep on investing in Bitcoin, if you keep on investing in meditation over time, what's my trajectory? Is it up? Is it flatlining? Is it down? No, it's in my case, it's been clearly up. It's been up in energy. It's been up in terms of impact, up in terms of ability to take on new challenges.
I guess decision making is one of those things that a lot of people, when you're invested in an asset that is quite volatile and has these peaks and troughs that we can call cycles and seasons or whatever that affects them, how do you think meditation can help people deal with the volatility of Bitcoin?
Sometimes I think simply by investing in Bitcoin, you learn. Once you've been through 1 or 2 cycles, just having been through it, that's often enough for people. They're used to it. And it's like, it doesn't affect me anymore. I'm used to it. It's 20%, 30% drawdown. I've lived through 80% drawdowns. This is nothing. So that's one way. For me, coming into it a little bit later and not having that experience, though, it's definitely been useful because it means I don't, of course, whilst I might have a preference that goes in one direction, I'm not attached to it. It's not how I define my self-worth. It's not ultimately the most important thing in life. It's an aspect of life. And so I'm able to detach and think, well, does the way I feel about this impact the result? And the answer is no. If I'm looking at a price chart and it's going down, whether I feel neutral about that or whether I feel sad about that, it's not going to affect the outcome, right? It's completely independent. So why don't I focus on the thing that I can impact, and that's my state of mind? So for me, personal sovereignty, because we talk a lot about sovereignty and self-sovereignty in Bitcoin, for me, having dominion over your own mind is the ultimate self-sovereignty. You can have the biggest stack in the world, but if you experience fear, anxiety on a regular basis, if someone says something you feel triggered, if you fear losing what you have, if you get roused to anger very easily, then is that freedom? I would say no. Freedom is when you have freedom over your own mind. Freedom is when, irrespective of outside events, you can maintain your calmness. And that's, when there's a storm going around you and you're on a ship, what sort of captain do you want? Do you want a captain who's freaking out? Or do you want a captain who's just calm and tells you what to do, so you feel no matter what storms are happening around you, you have someone who you can depend upon.
That sounds very rational, and I think, there would be very few people who would object to anything you just said, right? But when the rubber hits the road, in action, in practice, when that price chart's going down, the lower it goes, the more inclined people are to sell.
Correct. This is something.
And the higher it is, the more
correct.
they're inclined they are to buy, right?
Yeah.
And so as much as people say that they're hodlers and whatever, we know, we can see it on chain, we can see it in the price chart. That's actually what happens, right? And then, like, I wonder how meditation, if it can help people to maintain a sense of calm, poise, composure, and mindful of what their purpose is.
Yeah. Well, it does. And I can say that because when in my coaching practice, it's one of the things, like, if people are going into business, I recommend that they engage in this. And the ones who have, they've certainly reported that benefit.
Do you mind if I ask you
Yeah.
about your coaching?
Yeah.
So do you call it mentorship? You certainly call it coaching. Is it, who is it for? What do you do that for?
Well, after running a technology company for a little while and stepping away from that, saying I'm onto the whatever the new thing's going to be, I didn't know exactly what it's going to be. I knew it was going to be something around helping people in some capacity. It was very vague. And it took me a long while to realize, well, the people I should help was people like me, as other technology entrepreneurs, because I've been through that experience. How obvious. And so I started coaching other technology entrepreneurs, and I had a lot of natural empathy for them because I'd been through many of the ups and downs they had. I'd seen firsthand what it's like to be in an ecosystem which places 100% of the emphasis on the scalability of the business and the technology, but almost 0% emphasis on the scalability of the people, which for me is the most important part. But even if you say it's one of three things that are all equally important, we still should put some effort into it. But I observed that most of the ways that we were using to try to grow the people in these technology companies were insufficient to deliver the result that we wanted. They weren't helping people to become better leaders. They weren't helping people to scale. They weren't helping people to learn better habits, better way to manage time, manage energy. They weren't showing people how to effectively coach and delegate so they could scale the organization and avoid becoming the bottleneck. They weren't helping people become self-aware of their own weaknesses and blind spots. And that was tremendously important because I'd lived through that. And I'd seen how the number one factor that influences the growth of a technology company is the capability of the founders. So I wanted to kind of help those people kind of be like the person I wish I had a little bit earlier myself, and did that for a number of years. And then coming to Bitcoin, I was doing less of that. And then there was someone else who said, well, why don't you combine the two worlds? And why don't you start coaching some people in the Bitcoin ecosystem? And I thought, oh, well, that's obvious. But it wasn't to me. But someone else pointed it out, so I did. And yeah, just naturally, I've started coaching some people in the Bitcoin ecosystem as well. So today it's any combination of technology entrepreneurs, hedge fund managers, on-chain analysts, activists, people who are, been very successful in one technology company. Now they're leading a second, or they're onto their next gig.
Do you find repeating patterns of behavior common or more common in impeding people and their potential?
In terms of impeding people?
So across the
Yes.
people that you've coached, are there any repeating patterns that you can share with us to be mindful of?
In terms of what impedes people?
Yeah.
Absolutely. So I'll use the example of capital raising, because even if you're not needing to raise capital, what I like about capital raising is it gives us data, because you can tell, okay, was your approach successful or not? Did you raise capital or not? It's binary. And it starts with mindset, and the mindset of someone who, and this was me, I was very unsuccessful raising capital for a long time. And the mindset would be looking to blame external circumstances for your conundrum. So for example, you might say, oh, well, it's just a really hard time to raise capital right now. Or in New Zealand, it was like, oh, well, it's really hard to raise capital in New Zealand. Or there's not enough money. Or the market isn't mature enough, or there's not enough people who get it. or investors are just looking to make a buck, or they don't care about value. So all of those rationalizations, they are designed to grow and protect our ego, but they're not designed to help grow us as people, to help us to go through challenges. And what I've found is that if there was one thing, it's the decision, am I here to grow my ego or am I here to grow myself? And choose one. Choose carefully. Growing the ego will protect you in the moment and you'll feel more comfortable because you can blame some external event and you can feel validated. And that'll be comfortable today. But by following that pattern, it'll be deeply uncomfortable into the future. Whereas acknowledging, no, actually, it wasn't that. If I'd really known how to pitch effectively, I could have still done it. It was my communication. I failed to make it apparent. We have great value in what we're doing, but I'm not articulating. I'm not being the bridge for that. We haven't cracked the business model. There's some things that I should have done as an entrepreneur that I haven't done yet. Those are more confronting conclusions to come to, and the ego will avoid coming to those conclusions. But if we honestly introspect and look at what can I do, irrespective of whether there's a headwind or a tailwind, doesn't matter. If you're in the Tour de France and you know how to cycle a bike, then you can ride through a tailwind, a headwind, you can go through the Alps, you can go out the other side because you have the energy, you have the VO2 max to be able to go through it. But if you don't have the skills and the resilience, then it doesn't matter. You won't survive. So having that mindset that I have more power than external events is the most important disposition. So it's not a skill set, it's a mindset.
Taking responsibility and demonstrating agency.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, no matter what the environmental factors are, there's someone out there raising capital right now successfully, right?
Correct.
You're not the only person doing what you're doing. You're not the first person under these circumstances to be raising capital.
Yeah.
And that's something that I used to remind myself all the time. And like, you're not doing anything novel here. Mm-hmm. You're not the first person to do this. And no matter what the challenge was, that statement in and of itself is almost always true. You're not the first person in the world to have done this, whether it's going for your license or, learning to ride a bike or whatever it is. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah. And they're not better than me. Like they can't all be better than me, right? And then they can't all have succeeded down to luck. And so as soon as you realize that, and you go, well, what's the excuse, really?
I think the reason I say that the mindset is more important than skill set is if you have that mindset of taking responsibility and seeing that you are more powerful than external events, then that will compel you to learn the skills that are the current gap. So if you have that growth mindset plus self-awareness, the growth mindset will cause you to want to grow. The self-awareness will show the areas to grow that will give you the biggest dividends. And that combined will allow you then to develop all the other skills. But if you have a set of skills without the self-awareness, the growth mindset, that set of skills will stagnate. So that's why I say mindset always is much more important than skill set.
How do you find founders and people generally self-sabotage? That's a big one for me. It's like, I'm great in a crisis. And I think if I told you a little bit more about myself, my background, you'd understand why. I'm great in a crisis. And then when things just get a little too comfortable, I've had to come to terms with that disposition. I start to seek adventure and risk. And that can sort of bleed over into recklessness and carelessness.
Yeah. Well, look, that's one tendency. I think there's a whole gamut of areas where we have recourse to self-sabotage, and we're very creative. We have this wonderful, we're blessed and cursed with this incredible intellect. But it's not intelligence which dictates your success. It's how you use that intelligence. Intelligence is like water. Water can be a creative force or a destructive force. But the banks of the river, what's that? That's your commitments. That's your focus. That's having some goal. That's the reason for having goals, is it's not the goal you achieve so much as the fact that you now have the riverbanks to channel your intellectual and emotional and spiritual energy towards something of value, so that creative energy now has a point which it can reach so that it doesn't become a floodplain and become destructive or self-destructive.
That's interesting because, I don't set goals for Bitcoin Archive. I have a very general direction that's quite ambitious. But I don't have particular targets.
That's good.
Do you think that's functionally okay?
Absolutely.
As a principle to operate on?
Absolutely. Look, it's an equilibrium where I've got, and again, I've experimented with this. So I've gone through periods where I've had no goals at all. I've had periods where I've had goals and it's been very structured step by step. And what I've learned is pretty much what you outline, which is you have a goal where you're very clear on the destination, right? What it is. So we were up at Cheat Code the other day. Peter McCormack has a very clear goal. It's take Bedford,
To the
real
Premier
Bedford
League.
to the Premier League.
Mhm.
Right? You ask him his goal, it's like, he'll say that first before he says anything about Bitcoin. It's take real Bedford to the Premier League. Now, does he know every step of the way? No, he does not. And whether it's entrepreneurs or artists or sportsmen and women, doesn't matter. They'll all have that same sense where they're very clear on the goal, but they don't necessarily know every step there, nor should they. Because the moment you think you know every step, the universe will always have a better plan for you than you could have imagined. You may miss some crucial data. Quentin Tarantino used to say the same thing. He would say that the most important thing as a movie director, I'm using movie director as a director of anything you might want to create, is he said, it's not your job to implement the vision. It's your job to have a vision and then to be really clear on how to communicate that vision to other people so that they, with you, can create that vision. And that's what every leader does. They're really clear on where they're going. They're really clear on communicating not just where they're going, but the reason that's a great place to go to. And then they empower the people to, as a collective, go in that direction. That's what Satoshi Nakamoto ultimately did with Bitcoin. Was very clear on the white paper. There was no ambiguity about what he was creating. He didn't say, oh, we could use proof of work, we could use proof. No, it's like this, it's like this, it's like this. Laid it out. Very clear. So he's clear on what he was creating. He's clear on why he was creating it. It was to get around the trust issues which broke down between central banks and governments, and how there was a need for a trustless system. Very clear why. But then he said, well, I don't have to be the one who builds this entire architecture. And then it was literally handed over to a community of people. But he didn't hand it over to start with. He gave the white paper. He mined some Bitcoin. He had a very clear why, and he was involved in the early stages. And then he empowered a community of people to be able to make it much bigger than he could do it himself. And whether you stay on as a founder, whether you don't, beyond that point, it's not important, because now you've got a groundswell of people who are creating a mission which you didn't create. You were just the vehicle through which it came.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And the analog for founders of businesses, definitely, it resonates with me in terms of the next stages of Bitcoin archive. So it'll be really interesting to take those next steps. Daniel, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have guests on this podcast at any time in any format, but it's especially a beautiful thing when you can come in and I can show off my studio.
Your studio looks great, I got to say. It's awesome.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Job, and it's really amazing because, like I say, you were the second person who ever interviewed me on a podcast way back when, and you were very gracious, and you helped to spread the message that I cared about. So very happy that we could be meeting in person.
Finally,
3 years later.
3 years later. Yeah, I mean, I love it. One of the things that's a pure privilege of having this account is that it does give me the discretion to elevate certain voices that I find interesting or perhaps haven't gained the recognition that I think they deserve, and that's purely at my discretion. And I love the opportunity to be able to do that. And I think I try to exercise that quite prudently and fairly. So it's been a pleasure of mine to see your account growing in prominence and you becoming more and more influential in the world of Bitcoin energy. And so, it's been my pleasure to do that. And thank you for all the advocacy work that you do, because, like, I can't do it. There are very few people who are as well positioned as you are to do it. I know it's a tireless thing. Sometimes it feels hard for sure, but you can see in the last 3 years how much progress has been made. You're starting to see sort of a groundswell of corroborating information coming out independent of you, and you're kind of I don't want to say that. I'll say it off. I'll say it off air. But you've you've sparked the fire, sparked the match, and the fire is taking hold. And the information about Bitcoin becoming or being good for the environment is certainly something that's gaining traction and momentum out there. So thank you very much for the work that you do. And once again, thank you for joining us in the studio.
It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
You're always welcome to come back too.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.